There is a subtle fear that shapes many modern lives, even when it is never consciously acknowledged. It is not the fear of failure, not the fear of rejection, not even the fear of death. It is the fear of wholeness. Most people assume they want to be whole, integrated, complete, at peace. But when life begins to move in that direction, when deeper coherence starts to form, resistance often appears. Suddenly, clarity feels threatening. Change feels destabilizing. Old identities feel safer than deeper truths. This fear does not arise by accident. It emerges from a confusion about who or what is meant to be in charge. Carl Jung observed that much psychological suffering stems not from chaos alone, but from the ego's attempt to protect itself from a larger organizing principle within the psyche. The ego believes its task is survival. The psyche seeks wholeness. These aims are not identical. The ego forms early in life as a center of orientation. It learns to navigate reality, avoid danger, secure attachment, and maintain continuity. In doing so, it develops preferences, values, and narratives about who one is and how one should live. This structure is necessary. Without it, there is no individuality, but the ego's strength, its ability to define and defend identity, also becomes its limitation. Wholeness threatens the ego because wholeness does not preserve identities. It reorganizes them. To the ego, wholeness feels like loss. Loss of control, loss of certainty, loss of the familiar self. This is why people often resist inner change, even when they consciously desire it. The ego senses that something larger is pressing in a force that does not negotiate on the ego's terms. The psyche does not ask whether you are ready. It responds to imbalance. When neglected aspects of the personality begin to surface, the ego experiences this as destabilization. Old certainties weaken. Clear self-images blur. Values that once felt solid begin to feel provisional. This produces anxiety, not because something is wrong, but because something larger is trying to emerge. The ego interprets this emergence as danger. It tightens its grip. It doubles down on familiar roles. It reinforces identity narratives. It seeks external validation to compensate for internal uncertainty. This is the paradox. The more the ego tries to protect itself, the more tension it creates. Jung noticed that many people arrive at therapy not because life has fallen apart externally, but because their internal authority has been quietly undermined. What once guided them no longer feels sufficient. They say things like, "I don't know what I want anymore. I feel disconnected from myself. I did everything I was supposed to do, and it still feels empty." These statements are not signs of failure. They are signs that the ego is encountering its limits. The fear that arises at this point is often misnamed. People think they fear chaos, instability, or loss of control. But beneath these fears lies something more precise. The fear of being reorganized around something other than the ego. Wholeness does not mean comfort. It means alignment with the totality of the psyche. And that totality includes elements the ego did not choose: contradictions, shadow traits, unlived potentials, and deeper values that may conflict with one's constructed identity. The ego fears wholeness because wholeness exposes the partial nature of its authority. It reveals that consciousness is not the sole center of the personality, that meaning does not originate from preference alone, that life has its own direction, independent of ego intention. This realization can feel humiliating. It can also feel liberating. But before liberation is possible, the ego resists. Understanding this resistance is essential. Without it, people either cling to rigid identities or collapse into confusion. Mistaking the loss of ego dominance for psychological failure, Jung did not see this moment as pathology. He saw it as a threshold. In the chapters that follow, we will clarify what the ego actually is, what it is not, and how it differs from the deeper center Jung called the self. Only then can we understand why wholeness feels threatening and why it remains unavoidable. For now, it is enough to recognize this. The ego does not fear destruction. It fears displacement. and what seeks to displace it is not chaos, but a more complete order of the psyche itself. To understand why the ego fears wholeness, we must first correct the widespread misunderstanding about what the ego actually is. The ego is often blamed for psychological suffering. It is portrayed as selfish, defensive, narcissistic, or immature, something to be diminished or overcome. This caricature misses the point. Carl Jung did not see the ego as an enemy. He saw it as a necessary organ of consciousness. The ego is the center of awareness. It gathers perceptions. It remembers. It chooses. It says I in the midst of experience. Without the ego, there would be no continuity of identity, no responsibility, no capacity to act deliberately in the world. The ego allows a person to differentiate themselves from their environment and from others. It makes individuality possible, but the ego was never meant to rule the psyche. Its true function is mediation, not domination. The ego stands between inner and outer worlds. It negotiates between instinct and reality, desire and limitation, impulse and consequence. When it functions well, it provides orientation without rigidity. Problems arise when the ego forgets this role. Early in life, the ego learns that clarity and control bring safety. Naming things reduces anxiety. Predictability protects attachment. Over time, the ego develops a belief rarely conscious that what it can understand and manage is what deserves to exist. This belief is understandable. It is also false. The ego's field of awareness is narrow by design. It cannot contain the full complexity of the psyche without losing coherence. Its task is not to hold everything, but to relate to what exceeds it. When the ego tries to expand beyond its natural limits, it becomes inflated. When it refuses to engage with what lies beyond it, it becomes rigid. In both cases, its mediating function collapses. Jung observed that a healthy ego knows what it knows and what it does not. It can say, I am aware of this. I am influenced by that. I do not fully understand this yet. An unhealthy ego demands certainty where none is possible. It insists on explanations for experiences that are symbolic rather than literal. It reduces complexity to slogans, identities, or moral positions. This reduction provides short-term stability. It creates long-term imbalance. The ego's true strength lies in its capacity for reflection. Reflection means the ability to step back from immediate reaction, to notice emotion without being consumed by it, to consider impulse without acting it out blindly, to question certainty without dissolving into doubt. This reflective capacity is what allows the ego to enter into relationship with the unconscious. When reflection is absent, the ego reacts. When reflection is present, the ego responds. This difference is subtle but decisive. A reactive ego seeks control. A responsive ego seeks understanding. Modern culture often trains people to strengthen the ego in only one dimension: performance, achievement, efficiency, self-presentation. These skills are useful in the external world, but they do not automatically deepen the ego's reflective capacity. A person can be highly competent and psychologically fragile, highly articulate and inwardly blind. The ego becomes fragile when it is overburdened with tasks it was never meant to perform, such as providing ultimate meaning, moral certainty, or existential direction. These functions belong to a deeper center of the psyche. When the ego tries to fulfill them alone, it becomes anxious, defensive, and controlling. It must constantly reinforce its narratives because it senses often dimly that they are provisional. This is why the ego reacts so strongly to inner contradiction, why it resists ambiguity, why it fears letting go of familiar identities even when they no longer feel alive. It is not weakness, it is overload. The ego was not designed to carry the weight of the whole psyche. It was designed to relate to it consciously. When the ego accepts this limitation, something important happens. It no longer has to pretend to be the final authority. It can listen without collapsing. It can question without disintegrating. This does not diminish individuality. It deepens it. A well-functioning ego is not loud. It is steady. It does not demand constant certainty. It tolerates not knowing. It does not confuse its preferences with destiny. It remains open to This is why Jung insisted that ego development is not about erasing the ego, but about placing it in right relationship to the deeper center of the psyche. Until this relationship is clarified, the ego will continue to fear wholeness because it mistakes wholeness for annihilation. In the next chapter, we will begin to clarify what lies beyond the ego's authority. We will explore the self not as an abstract ideal, but as the organizing center that gives direction to the psyche as a whole. Only then will the ego's fear and its proper role be fully intelligible. When Jung spoke of the self, he was not introducing a higher version of the ego, nor an ideal personality one should aspire to become. This distinction is essential, because confusing the self with identity is one of the most common and dangerous misunderstandings in psychology. Carl Jung used the word self to name the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective, ordered and chaotic, known and unknown. The self is not something you construct, it is something you belong to. Where the ego experiences itself as a center, the self functions as a field. It holds opposites without resolving them prematurely. It organizes the psyche not around preference or comfort, but around balance and meaning. This is why the self does not feel personal in the way the ego does. Encounters with the self often feel impersonal, even humbling. They carry a sense of necessity rather than choice. A person may feel called, compelled, or reoriented by forces they did not consciously select. The ego asks, "Who am I?" The self asks, "What must be lived?" This difference explains much of the tension between them. The ego seeks continuity. The self seeks wholeness. Continuity protects identity. Wholeness demands transformation. When the self begins to assert itself, the ego often experiences this as threat. Old roles lose their vitality. Long-held goals feel strangely empty. Values that once guided life no longer provide direction. From the ego's point of view, this feels like loss. From the perspective of the self, it is reorganization. Jung emphasized that the self is not moral in a conventional sense. It does not align neatly with social values, cultural expectations, or personal ideals. Its concern is not goodness as defined by the ego, but psychic balance. This is deeply unsettling. The ego wants reassurance that growth will preserve what it loves. The self offers no such guarantees. It may require the relinquishing of identities that once ensured belonging, status, or security. This is why people often resist deeper psychological change even when they consciously desire it. The ego senses that the price of wholeness is the loss of control over the narrative of the self, yet the self is not destructive. It does not seek to erase the ego, it seeks to relativize it. The ego is asked to take its proper place not as ruler, but as participant. When this relationship is misunderstood, two extremes appear. In one, the ego rejects the self entirely. Life becomes rigid, over-controlled, and increasingly empty. Meaning is sought externally, and symptoms multiply as compensation. In the other, the ego identifies with the self. This produces inflation, the belief that one's inner experiences confer special status, authority, or insight. Jung warned that this state often masquerades as spiritual awakening while quietly undermining psychological balance. True relationship to the self lies between these extremes. It is marked not by certainty, but by orientation, not by superiority, but by humility, not by escape from conflict, but by the capacity to hold it consciously. The self communicates indirectly. It does not issue commands. It reveals itself through symbols, dreams, emotional patterns, and recurring themes that shape a life over time. Its presence is often recognized only in retrospect. A person sees that what felt like disruption was in fact alignment with a deeper pattern. This is why Jung rejected the idea that psychology should make life easier. He believed it should make life truer. Truth, in this sense, is not factual accuracy. It is fidelity to the totality of the psyche. The self does not promise peace. It promises direction. Direction emerges when the ego relinquishes its claim to absolute authority and enters into dialogue with the deeper center of the psyche. This dialogue is not dramatic. It unfolds slowly through attention, reflection, and responsibility. In the next chapter, we will examine what happens when this dialogue fails, when the ego either inflates itself to divine proportions or collapses under the weight of unconscious forces. These distortions reveal, by contrast, what a balanced relationship between ego and self actually requires. When the relationship between ego and self becomes distorted, the psyche does not remain neutral. It compensates. This compensation tends to move in one of two directions, both of which Jung considered dangerous. The first is ego inflation. The second is ego collapse. At first glance, these states appear opposite. In reality, they emerge from the same misunderstanding: confusion about who is meant to be at the center of the psyche. Carl Jung warned that ego inflation is not simply arrogance or vanity. It is a psychological condition in which the ego mistakes a transpersonal force for personal identity. Inflation often begins subtly. A person experiences insight, clarity, or moral certainty. They feel aligned, energized, and purposeful. This can happen through intellectual discovery, spiritual experience, creative breakthrough, or even social validation. At this stage, nothing is necessarily wrong. The danger appears when the ego concludes, "This experience makes me special." The ego begins to identify with the authority of the self. What was once a guiding orientation becomes a personal entitlement. Insight hardens into certainty. Meaning becomes mission. Meaning becomes mission. Doubt is reinterpreted as ignorance or resistance in others. Inflation does not feel chaotic. It feels powerful. This is why it is so difficult to recognize. Inflated egos often speak in absolutes. They feel morally justified. They experience disagreement as threat rather than dialogue. Jung observed this pattern not only in individuals, but in leaders, movements, and ideologies. When the ego identifies with transpersonal meaning, it becomes incapable of self-correction. The psyche loses balance. At the other extreme lies the ego collapse. Here, the ego does not inflate, disintegrates. This occurs when unconscious material overwhelms conscious structure. Emotional intensity floods awareness without containment. Meaning dissolves rather than crystallizes. Direction is lost. A person in ego collapse may feel helpless, fragmented, or powerless. They may experience anxiety, depression, or a profound sense of disorientation. Life feels too large, too complex, too demanding. Where inflation claims omnipotence, collapse experiences impotence. Yet both states arise from the same core problem. The ego either oversteps its limits or refuses to engage with what lies beyond them. In inflation, the ego says, "I am the center." In collapse, the ego says, "I have no center." Neither position is sustainable. Jung emphasized that psychological health lies between these extremes. The ego must be strong enough to maintain coherence, yet humble enough to recognize its limits. Strength without humility leads to domination. Humility without strength leads to dissolution. Modern culture often oscillates between these poles. On one hand, it celebrates individual exceptionalism, certainty, and self-definition. On the other, it witnesses rising confusion, loss of meaning, and psychological fragility. Both reflect imbalance in the ego-self relationship. Inflation is often mistaken for confidence. Collapse is often mistaken for weakness. In truth, both are failures of orientation. The ego was never meant to replace the self, nor was it meant to dissolve into it. It was meant to stand in relationship. This relationship requires tension. It requires the ego to tolerate being guided by something it does not fully control without surrendering responsibility. When this tension is held, insight remains flexible, meaning remains alive, authority remains provisional. When it is not held, the psyche compensates forcefully. Jung saw many modern neuroses not as illnesses in the traditional sense, but as signals that the ego self-axis had been distorted. Either the ego had become inflated beyond its proper scale, or it had collapsed under pressures it was never meant to carry alone. Understanding these distortions is not about diagnosis. It is about prevention, recognizing early signs of inflation or rigidity, moral certainty. Inability to listen allows for humility before damage is done. Recognizing early signs of collapse, exhaustion, loss of direction, emotional flooding allows for support and reorientation rather than shame. In both cases, the remedy is not elimination of the ego, but realignment. In the next chapter, we will explore one of the most misunderstood manifestations of ego inflation, the Messiah complex, the belief that one's personal life has become synonymous with universal meaning. This phenomenon reveals, with particular clarity, why the ego fears wholeness and how easily wholeness can be mistaken for personal destiny. Among the many distortions Jung observed in the relationship between ego and self, one stands out for its subtlety and its danger, what is often called the Messiah complex. This term is frequently misunderstood. It does not refer only to religious delusion, nor does it require grandiose claims of divinity. In Jungian psychology, the Messiah complex is far more common and far more ordinary. It emerges whenever the ego identifies with a transpersonal source of meaning and mistakes that meaning for personal identity. Carl Jung encountered this pattern repeatedly in intelligent, morally serious, and psychologically sensitive individuals. These were not narcissists seeking attention. Often, they were people who genuinely wanted to do good. The process usually begins with an authentic experience. A person feels called toward truth, justice, healing, or transformation. They sense a purpose larger than personal comfort. Their life acquires direction and intensity. This can be a profoundly positive development. The danger appears when the ego draws the wrong conclusion. Instead of saying, something meaningful is moving through me, the ego begins to say, I am the source of this meaning. At this point, the boundary between ego and self collapses. The individual no longer experiences meaning as something to serve, but as something they are. Responsibility hardens into destiny. Insight becomes obligation. Doubt becomes betrayal of a sacred mission. This is the Messiah complex. It does not announce itself with arrogance. It announces itself with necessity. The person feels that they cannot step back, that they must carry the burden others cannot. That compromise would be a moral failure. That rest would be abandonment of truth. The ego experiences itself as indispensable. Jung saw this as one of the most destructive psychological positions because it eliminates humility. When the ego believes it embodies meaning itself, it becomes incapable of correction. Feedback is interpreted as resistance. Opposition is experienced as moral threat. The psyche loses balance. This complex often disguises itself as self-sacrifice. The person believes they are giving everything for a cause. But psychologically, something else is happening. The ego is feeding on the authority of the self. Meaning, which should orient life, is consumed by identity. This leads inevitably to exhaustion. No individual can sustain a transpersonal burden indefinitely. When the ego carries what belongs to the self, collapse follows. Burnout, bitterness, or disillusionment often appear now, because the original values were false, but because the relationship to them was distorted. Jung observed that many crises of faith, purpose, or morality occurred not because meaning was lost, but because it was over-identified with. The psyche does not tolerate this confusion. If the ego refuses to relinquish its inflated position, The unconscious compensates by undermining it. Failures appear, relationships fracture, energy withdraws. What once felt divinely guided becomes heavy and joyless. This collapse can feel like betrayal. In truth, it is correction. The self does not seek representatives, it seeks relationship. The Messiah complex collapses when the ego recognizes that meaning is not owned, it is participated in. The individual is not the center through which the world must be saved. They are one expression among many in a larger pattern. This realization is painful. It is also liberating. When the ego steps out of the role of savior, energy returns. Responsibility becomes human again. Values can be lived without absolutism. Jung did not argue against purpose or commitment. He argued against confusing purpose with identity. You can serve meaning without becoming it. You can live truth without claiming ownership of it. This distinction protects both the psyche and the world. In the next chapter, we will turn from inflation to confusion to the modern experience of identity loss, where the ego no longer knows what to serve and meaning feels fragmented or inaccessible. This confusion, too, reveals the tension between ego and self-and. What happens when orientation is lost? If ego inflation mistakes meaning for identity, modern identity confusion does something different. It loses contact with meaning altogether. Many people today do not feel grandiose or chosen. They feel unsure, fragmented, and ungrounded. They do not believe they are at the center of the world. They are not convinced of anything at all. Carl Jung saw this condition emerging long before it became widespread. He understood it as the psychological consequence of an ego that has lost its orientation to the self without developing a viable substitute. In earlier forms of life, identity was anchored by stable symbolic frameworks, religion, myth, ritual, and shared narratives that located the individual within a larger pattern of meaning. These frameworks were imperfect, often rigid, and sometimes oppressive, but they provided orientation. Modern life dismantled many of these structures without replacing their psychological function. The result is an ego that is highly developed in terms of choice and self-definition, but poorly supported in terms of meaning. People are told they can be anything. They are rarely shown how to be anything. Identity becomes a project rather than a discovery. Something assembled rather than something revealed. At first, this feels liberating. Over time, it becomes exhausting. When identity is no longer grounded in a deeper organizing principle, the ego must constantly reinvent itself. Values shift, roles multiply. Beliefs are adopted and discarded with increasing speed. The sense of self becomes flexible but fragile. This fragility often appears as anxiety, not fear of a specific threat, but fear of incoherence, fear of choosing wrongly, fear of committing to something that may later feel false. The ego hesitates because it no longer trusts its own decisions. Without a relationship to the self, preference replaces direction, and preference is unstable. People begin to ask questions that feel personal but are structural. Who am I, really? What should I do with my life? Why does nothing feel solid? Why does every identity feel temporary? These questions are not signs of immaturity. They are signs of disorientation. Jung understood that when the ego is cut off from the self, it does not become neutral, it becomes vulnerable to external substitutes for meaning. Identity is then borrowed rather than grounded. Ideologies provide ready-made certainty. Communities provide belonging. Labels provide clarity. Moral positions provide direction. These substitutes are not inherently false. They become dangerous when they are used to compensate for the absence of inner orientation. The ego clings to them because it feels unmoored. Modern identity confusion often alternates between two extremes. In one, the ego commits fully to an identity, political, moral, professional, or personal only, to later feel trapped by it. Disillusionment follows. Cynicism sets in. The identity is abandoned. In the other, the ego refuses commitment altogether. Everything remains provisional. Nothing is taken seriously for long. Life becomes fluid, but shallow. Both positions reflect the same underlying problem. The ego is trying to orient itself without reference to the deeper center of the psyche. The self does not dictate identities. It provides direction. When this direction is absent, the ego substitutes movement for meaning. Change becomes a way to avoid the anxiety of commitment. Reinvention becomes a defense against depth. Jung did not believe the solution was to return to old belief systems or impose new dogmas. He believed the task was psychological, to re-establish the ego-self relationship consciously. Without this relationship, identity will always feel provisional. With it, identity becomes flexible without losing coherence. This does not mean certainty returns. It means direction does. The ego no longer has to invent itself endlessly. It can respond to something that unfolds over time. Modern identity confusion is not a failure of freedom. It is the cost of freedom without orientation. The ego fears wholeness, not only because wholeness threatens its control, but because wholeness demands responsibility for inner life rather than endless self-definition. To relate to the self is to accept that not all possibilities are equally alive. Some paths carry energy, others drain it. This discernment cannot be outsourced to trends, labels, or ideologies. It must be lived when the ego stops trying to define itself. Absolutely. Something subtle but decisive changes in psychological life. Clarity does not suddenly appear. Certainty does not return. But confusion loosens its grip. What replaces it is direction. This distinction matters. Modern thinking often assumes that a meaningful life requires clear answers, fixed beliefs, stable identities, and coherent narratives that explain who one is and where one is going. Jung understood that this demand for certainty is itself a defense. The psyche does not move in straight lines. It moves in patterns. Carl Jung observed that when the ego relinquishes its insistence on total control, life begins to organize itself around recurring themes, rather than rigid conclusions. Meaning emerges not as an idea to possess, but as a direction to follow. Direction is different from decision. A decision closes possibilities. Direction opens a path. When a person is oriented toward the self, choices no longer need to be justified by perfect reasoning. They are guided by a felt sense of alignment, inner coherence that does not eliminate doubt, but places it within a larger context. This is why Jung resisted turning psychology into a system of prescriptions. He did not believe that life could be lived correctly by following rules. He believed it could be lived truthfully by attending to what unfolds. Truthfulness, in this sense, is not moral perfection. It is responsiveness. Responsiveness requires listening to emotions that resist explanation, to patterns that repeat despite intention, to dreams that disturb or illuminate, to moments when energy increases or withdraws without obvious cause. When the ego listens in this way, it begins to sense that not all choices are equal. Some paths feel heavy before they are even taken. Others carry a quiet sense of necessity, even when they are difficult. This necessity is not compulsion. It does not shout. It does not demand. It persists. Direction often reveals itself through resistance as much as attraction. The psyche resists lives that are too narrow, too performative, too disconnected from its deeper structure. It withdraws energy from roles that no longer serve integration. This withdrawal is often experienced as loss. People mourn identities they outgrow. They grieve futures that no longer feel possible. They feel disoriented when ambition fades or values shift. Jung did not see this as regression. He saw it as reorientation. When direction replaces certainty, the ego must tolerate ambiguity without rushing to resolution. And all it took was a single shiny object. That one lucky child found in order to change the future he saw it as reoriented. This is difficult because ambiguity feels like vulnerability. It exposes the ego's limits. It removes the illusion of mastery. Yet this vulnerability is precisely what allows the psyche to remain alive. Certainty freezes movement. Direction sustains it. A person oriented toward direction does not need to explain themselves constantly. They can move without complete justification. They can revise their understanding without feeling fraudulent. They can change without feeling that everything before was a mistake. This flexibility does not come from indecision. It comes from trust in a deeper organizing process. The ego still plans, it still chooses, it still takes responsibility. But it does so provisionally aware that meaning unfolds over time rather than being secured in advance. This awareness protects against both inflation and collapse. The ego no longer claims to know where life must lead, nor does it surrender into passivity. It participates. This participation requires patience. The psyche does not reveal its direction all at once. It communicates through sequences of events, encounters, conflicts, and symbols that gradually form a pattern. Only in retrospect does this pattern become visible. Jung often emphasized that life is understood backwards, but lived forwards. Direction cannot be grasped fully while one is moving through it. It can only be trusted. This trust is not blind faith. It is disciplined attention. Attention to what carries energy, attention to what depletes it, attention to where resistance intensifies, attention to where meaning quietly gathers. Direction without certainty demands humility. It asks the ego to remain alert without becoming rigid, engaged without becoming inflated, committed without becoming absolute. This posture does not promise ease. It promises coherence, and coherence, even when difficult, allows the psyche to move as a whole rather than fragmenting under the weight of competing demands. When direction is allowed to replace certainty, the ego no longer has to invent itself endlessly. It can respond to what emerges, step by step, without claiming final authority. This responsiveness is not weakness. It is the beginning of psychological maturity. As direction replaces certainty, another assumption quietly dissolves, that responsibility means control. Many people believe they are responsible only when they can predict outcomes, manage risks, and guarantee results. This belief places an impossible burden on the ego. It acts a limited center of consciousness to govern a psyche that extends far beyond it. Carl Jung offered a different understanding. For him, responsibility was not the ability to control inner life, but the willingness to relate consciously to it. This distinction is crucial. Control seeks to eliminate unpredictability. Responsibility seeks to remain present within it. When the ego insists on control, it treats inner movements as threats. Emotions must be subdued. Doubts must be resolved quickly. Desires must be justified or suppressed. Anything ambiguous is labeled dangerous. This posture narrows consciousness. The psyche responds by intensifying what has been excluded. What is pushed down returns indirectly through symptoms, compulsions, projections, and sudden disruptions that feel disproportionate and confusing. Responsibility, in Jung's sense, works differently. It begins with acknowledgement. This is happening in me. I did not choose it, but it is mine to attend to. This acknowledgement does not imply endorsement. To recognize an impulse is not to act it out. To admit an emotion is not to be ruled by it. To face a fantasy is not to make it real. Responsibility lies in bearing awareness. The ego's task is to hold what emerges in consciousness long enough for it to be understood symbolically rather than discharged impulsively. This holding is demanding. It requires patience, restraint, and a tolerance for inner tension. But it preserves freedom. When impulses are reflected upon rather than acted out, they lose their compulsive force. When emotions are named without being suppressed, they soften. When unconscious material is approached as meaningful rather than intrusive, it becomes intelligible. This is why Jung placed such emphasis on reflection. Reflection creates space between impulse and action. It allows the ego to respond rather than react. Modern life often undermines this capacity. Speed is rewarded. Reaction is encouraged. Immediate expression is mistaken for authenticity. In such conditions, responsibility is reduced to damage control after the fact. Jung's view is quieter and more demanding. Responsibility means staying with what is difficult to hold, staying with uncertainty without collapsing into paralysis, staying with desire without being consumed by it, staying with fear without projecting it outward. This does not make life easier. It makes it truer. When the ego relinquishes the fantasy of control, it does not become passive. It becomes attentive. Attention replaces force. Listening replaces domination. This shift allows the psyche to communicate more subtly. Signals no longer need to shout. Symptoms need not escalate. The system stabilizes not through suppression, but through recognition. Responsibility without control also changes how failure is understood. Mistakes are no longer interpreted as proof of unworthiness or incompetence. They become information indications that orientation has been lost or that an unconscious factor has been underestimated. This attitude protects against both shame and inflation. The ego neither condemns itself nor excuses itself, absolutely. It remains accountable without becoming punitive. Jung believed that this form of responsibility was rare, precisely because it offers no shortcuts. It cannot be reduced to rules or techniques. It must be practiced continuously. Yet it is the condition under which the ego and the self can coexist without distortion. The ego does not need to dominate to be responsible. It needs to remain present. Presence allows meaning to unfold without being coerced. It allows direction to clarify without being forced into certainty. It allows the psyche to move as a whole rather than breaking apart under pressure. When responsibility is understood in this way, wholeness no longer appears as threat. It appears as demand not for perfection, but for attention. Attention is the ego's deepest contribution. It is how consciousness honors what it cannot control. And it is how the psyche remains alive without becoming destructive. There are moments when meaning seems to recede from life without warning. What once mattered feels distant. What once guided decisions no longer carries weight. Activities continue, obligations remain, but the inner resonance is gone. This withdrawal is often interpreted as depression, burnout, or loss of motivation. While these labels describe aspects of the experience, they miss its psychological function. Carl Jung understood the withdrawal of meaning as a signal, not a verdict. Meaning does not vanish arbitrarily. It withdraws when it is no longer aligned with the psyche's deeper movement. The ego experiences this as deprivation. It asks, why has life gone flat? Why do I feel disconnected from what once sustained me? In response, it often tries to restore meaning by force through increased effort, new goals, louder affirmation, or external stimulation. These attempts rarely succeed. Meaning cannot be commanded. It must be encountered. When meaning withdraws, it often indicates that the ego has exhausted a particular orientation. The values that once organized life have fulfilled their function. Continuing to live by them would require denial or performance rather than participation. This moment is unsettling because it strips the ego of justification. Actions feel hollow. Success feels empty. Failure feels oddly irrelevant. The ego no longer knows what it is working for. This is not nihilism, it is transition. Jung observed that many people attempt to avoid this transition by clinging to identities that no longer feel alive. They repeat old roles out of loyalty or fear. They double down on certainty to avoid facing the unknown. But meaning does not return through repetition. It returns through reorientation. Reorientation begins with the willingness to tolerate emptiness without immediately filling it. This is difficult because emptiness feels like absence. In reality, it is often a clearing. When old meanings dissolve, space is created for new ones to emerge. But emergence requires patience. The psyche does not reveal its next orientation instantly. It unfolds through subtle cue shifts in interest, unexpected attractions, recurring questions, quiet resistances. The ego's task at this stage is not to manufacture purpose, but to remain available. Availability means listening without expectation. It means observing what draws energy and what drains it. It means noticing where curiosity persists despite uncertainty. This posture runs against modern habits. We are trained to fill gaps quickly, to optimize transitions, to avoid pauses. Yet psychologically, pauses are where reorganization occurs. When the ego allows meaning to withdraw without panic, the psyche often responds by reorganizing around a deeper alignment. This alignment may not resemble previous ambitions. It may be less visible, less impressive, less socially validated. But it carries weight. Jung believed that meaning rooted in the self feels different from meaning imposed by the ego. It is quieter, more durable, less dependent on recognition. It does not need constant reinforcement. This is why people sometimes describe a sense of rightness that lacks excitement, or a commitment that feels necessary rather than chosen. These experiences are not dramatic. They are grounded. The withdrawal of meaning tests the ego's capacity for humility. It asks whether one can endure not knowing without collapsing into despair or rushing into substitutes. Substitutes are tempting. They offer immediate coherence, but they often restore meaning at the cost of authenticity. When meaning returns prematurely, it returns distorted. Allowing meaning to withdraw is not resignation. It is participation in a deeper rhythm. The psyche moves in cycles. Expansion is followed by contraction. Orientation is followed by disorientation. Each phase carries its own demands. The ego suffers most when it mistakes contraction for failure, meaning withdraws not to punish, but to redirect. This redirection cannot be seen from the middle of it. It becomes intelligible only over time as the psyche reveals a new pattern. The ego's contribution during this period is restraint, resisting the urge to force clarity where none is ready to appear. Restraint preserves integrity. It keeps the psyche from fragmenting under pressure. It keeps the ego from inflating with borrowed certainty. It keeps the dialogue between ego and self alive. Meaning does not disappear forever. It returns when the ego is willing to receive it not as possession, but as orientation. And when it returns, it carries a different quality. Less dramatic, less absolute, more binding, because it does not belong to the ego. It belongs to the psyche as a whole. When the ego refuses relationship with the self, the psyche does not remain neutral. It compensates. The cost of this refusal is not immediate catastrophe, but gradual distortion of meaning, of relationships, and of inner life. Carl Jung was clear that wholeness cannot be negotiated away. It can be delayed, resisted, or misunderstood, but not avoided. What is refused consciously returns unconsciously, and it returns with less subtlety. Refusing wholeness often begins with avoidance. Avoidance of inner conflict, avoidance of contradiction. Avoidance of feelings that do not fit the preferred self-image. The ego convinces itself that stability requires simplification. It narrows identity, reduces complexity, and builds a life that appears coherent on the surface. For a time, this works. But narrowing has consequences. Energy drains from what is excluded. Creativity diminishes. Relationships become repetitive. Moral certainty hardens. Life feels managed rather than lived. The ego interprets this as fatigue or boredom. The psyche experiences it as stagnation. When stagnation persists, compensation intensifies. Unlived aspects of the personality seek expression through indirect means. Irritability appears where assertiveness was denied. Fantasies intrude where imagination was suppressed. Cynicism replaces conviction when values lose vitality. These are not random symptoms. They are messages. The psyche is signaling that life has become too one-sided. At this point, the ego often makes a second mistake. Instead of listening, it seeks reinforcement, more structure, more certainty, more identification with roles that promise security. This deepens the divide. What was once avoidance becomes rigidity. What was once stability becomes confinement. The ego becomes increasingly invested in defending an identity that no longer corresponds to inner reality. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in people who appeared successful, yet felt inexplicably hollow. Their lives were organized, productive, and socially validated, but psychologically distant from themselves. The cost of refusing wholeness is not dramatic suffering at first. It is loss of aliveness. Over time, this loss produces more visible consequences. Relationships lose depth because projection replaces encounter. Others are experienced as functions rather than persons. Conflict escalates because the ego cannot tolerate challenges to its self-image. Meaning collapses into routine. Eventually, the psyche forces confrontation. This confrontation may arrive as crisis, illness, breakdown, or profound disorientation. It may appear as depression that does not respond to effort, or anxiety that resists reassurance. It may come as a sudden loss of direction that feels disproportionate to circumstances. From the ego's perspective, this feels unfair. From the psyche's perspective, it is overdue. The psyche does not punish refusal, it corrects imbalance. Wholeness is not an ideal state to be achieved. It is a dynamic requirement. The psyche must be allowed to move, to integrate opposites, to reorganize around changing conditions. When this movement is blocked, pressure builds. Jung emphasized that psychological suffering often intensifies when a person insists on remaining who they were at the expense of who they are becoming. Refusal of wholeness is often refusal of change. Change threatens identity. Wholeness threatens control. Yet control without wholeness becomes brittle. The ego that refuses wholeness must constantly defend itself. It reacts strongly to criticism, clings to certainty, and interprets disagreement as threat. Life becomes a series of battles to maintain coherence. This posture exhausts both the ego and the psyche. By contrast, when wholeness is allowed even reluctantly, tension does not disappear, but it becomes meaningful. Conflict no longer feels like failure. It becomes information. The ego's task is not to eliminate conflict, but to stay present to it without retreating into defense or denial. Refusing wholeness delays this task. Accepting it begins a different kind of responsibility. Responsibility for the whole of one's inner life, not just the parts that are convenient, admirable, or socially rewarded. This responsibility is demanding. It is also stabilizing. A psyche that is allowed to integrate does not need to compensate destructively. Energy returns. Meaning deepens. Life regains texture. The cost of refusing wholeness is paid gradually in lost vitality and increasing rigidity. The cost of accepting it is paid differently in humility, uncertainty, and the willingness to be reorganized. The psyche will require one of these payments. It is not optional. The only question is whether the cost is borne consciously or extracted through suffering. At a certain point, the question shifts. It is no longer whether the ego and the self are in tension. That tension is unavoidable. The question becomes how one lives inside it. Carl Jung did not imagine psychological life as a state of resolution. He imagined it as a sustained relationship, one that must be renewed again and again as circumstances change. The ego does not disappear when a person becomes more conscious. It becomes more relative. Relative not in the sense of unimportant, but in the sense of contextual. The ego knows it is not the whole, yet it remains responsible for action, decision, and accountability in the world. This is the mature position. The ego neither claims absolute authority nor abdicates responsibility. It stands between inner and outer realities, listening carefully to both. Living this way requires restraint from identifying completely with moods, thoughts, or impulses, restraint from turning insight into ideology, restraint from confusing temporary clarity with final truth. It also requires courage to act without guarantees, courage to commit without certainty, courage to remain present when inner life becomes contradictory. The ego's maturity is measured not by how much it controls, but by how much complexity it can bear without collapsing or hardening. This capacity is rare. Many people prefer the comfort of rigid identities or the relief of surrendering responsibility altogether. Both avoid the tension that individuation demands, yet individuation, for Jung, was not a heroic achievement, it was a necessity. To individuate is not to become exceptional. It is to become answerable to the totality of one's psyche. This answerability changes how life is lived. Decisions are no longer justified solely by social approval or personal preference. They are tested inwardly by whether they deepen coherence or increase fragmentation. Success is no longer measured only by achievement, but by alignment. Failure is no longer defined solely by outcome, but by whether one acted in fidelity to what was alive at the time. This does not remove doubt. It places doubt within a meaningful frame. Jung believed that the greatest danger of modern life was not suffering, but in consciousness, the refusal to see how inner forces shape behavior, values, and destiny. Consciousness does not make life painless, it makes life inhabited. When the ego remains in relationship with the self, symptoms lose some of their violence. They still appear, but they arrive as signals rather than invasions. Conflicts still arise, but they carry information rather than chaos. Life becomes less dramatic, but more grounded, less certain, but more truthful. This posture does not promise happiness. It promises integrity. Integrity means that the parts of the psyche are no longer at war. They remain in tension, but the tension is held consciously rather than acted out destructively. The ego's role, in the end, is modest and demanding. It must pay attention. It must reflect. It must decide without claiming absolute knowledge. It must listen without surrendering agency. This is not mastery. It is participation. To live between ego and self is to accept that one is neither the author of meaning nor its passive recipient. Meaning emerges through engagement, through the ongoing dialogue between what one knows and what remains unknown. This dialogue never ends, but when it is honored, life no longer feels arbitrary. Even difficulty carries direction. Even loss reveals necessity. The ego fears wholeness because it senses that wholeness will not obey it. What it eventually discovers is something quieter and more enduring. Wholeness does not erase the ego. It gives it a place. And in that place, the ego is no longer required to pretend it is the center of the psyche. It is required only to remain awake. If you liked this video, please like, and if you enjoy watching this kind of content, subscribe for more. Thank you.